The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
As of the 2000 census, Hispanics are the nation's largest minority. Although viewed by many as one ethnic group, Hispanics in fact come from a variety of countries and cultural roots. How have their different backgrounds affected their success? How are they changing America? And how is America changing for them? To find out, Policy Watch is joined by Roberto Suro, director of the Pew Hispanic Center and author of Strangers Among Us, Latino Lives in a Changing America. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Roberto Suro, welcome to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
Thank you.
We are delighted to have you here. You are the director of the Pew Hispanic Center. But you started out in your professional career as a journalist, right?
Correct, yeah. For a little more than 25 years, I was a print journalist for a variety of newspapers and magazines and such.
Which ones?
Most recently, the Washington Post, and before that, the New York Times, and before that, Time Magazine.
And your beat was?
I covered a lot of different things, national security affairs, domestic policy. I was overseas in the Middle East and in Europe and in Latin America. And along the way, off and on, but through the whole of it, periodically immigration and the Hispanic community.
And now you're here at the Pew Hispanic Center. But someplace in that process, you wrote this wonderful book. It's called Strangers Among Us, Latino Lives in a Changing America. What do you mean by a changing America?
Well, one of, I think the key things to understand about this moment of immigration, really, it was true of other great eras of immigration. They tend to coincide with periods of change in the host country. And in the United States has been going through a process of both economic and demographic change while it's incorporating this new population, and all of those things kind of interrelate. One wouldn't happen without the other, and the impact of immigration is greatly magnified because of the changes that are happening in the host society.
Now, there's a tendency on the part of the popular press to think of immigration and Latinos or Hispanics. Why is that? I mean, there are other immigrants to the country.
Yeah, but people from Latin America comprise by far the largest share of the migrant stream now, and certainly a large linguistic group of a sort that's we haven't seen. There's no real parallel to that during the European era, although there were. The closest was the very large concentration of German-speaking peoples who came, but. And they're the most, in some ways, the most visible. They tend to be the most concentrated in a lot of cities. The next largest category are Asians, which are comprised of many nationalities, and it's much more fragmented.
Well, that's interesting you said that. I was going to back up. I noticed you said people from Latin America in response to my label of Hispanics or Latinos. And I know labels change and so forth. When I was much younger, I was trained to say Hispanic in the East, except in New York where I was trained to say Puerto Rican. When I was in Texas, I was supposed to say Mexican American. I think I have this right. And when I was in Los Angeles, I was supposed to say Chicano. But all that's changing. Would you mind walking us through how people from Latin America, what they like to call themselves, what they do call themselves?
Well, the most important thing to remember is that the idea that all of these people fit under one kind of a label or grouping is an entirely American confection. It doesn't, people in Latin America don't, it's not one of the sort of primary identities to think of yourself as a Hispanic. People think of themselves as Mexicans or Costa Ricans or Ecuadorians or Venezuelans, and national identities are much stronger. And they bring national identities here. And if you ask Hispanics, I mean, we've done this in several polls, asked people, do you think that Latinos from different countries share a common culture, or do they have distinct cultures? And in the most recent survey we did, 3/4 said they're separate and distinct cultures. The labels Hispanic and Latino have sort of different origins. Hispanic tends to be a little bit more popular on the East Coast, Latinos more popular on the West Coast. There are some people who call themselves Latinos who take offense at being called Hispanics. It's not so much the other way around. If you ask people who self-identify as one or the other if it's important to them which of the two, you get fairly solid majority saying it doesn't matter which label you use.
And there's a generational dimension to this as well, isn't there?
Well, there is, in one of the sort of unknowns. One of the things that's evolving now is the question of how strong this pan-ethnic identity is going to become, particularly among the children of immigrants who comprise a very large share of this population, and whether they will see themselves, how much they'll see themselves as part of this sort of greater population, as opposed to thinking of themselves as Mexicans or Puerto Ricans or just as Americans, or some combination of the three, which is actually what's most likely and what's most common in the children of immigrants, this sort of a mixture of identities that sort of flow back and forth and find different expressions depending on context.
Now, I may be on thin ice here, so you help me and protect me here. But it seems to me that the experiences of different Latin groups have been so different in this country. The Cubans have one story, Puerto Ricans another story, and I think your father comes from Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. Mexican Americans, as you were saying, it's the largest portion of immigrants are from Mexico. Central Americans. It seems as if, from a distance, that they each have a different story, and a different story of how they're doing in this country. Is it reasonable to think about those communities separately?
Yeah, and in some ways it's important to think about them separately, because people came here in different ways and with different histories. What happens to them here depends a lot on where they land and what the immediate context of reception is, even what city they arrive to and when. And you've got...
Let's start with Miami, where the last time I was there I saw a sign in the window that said, English spoken here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's probably a little tongue-in-cheek. But I mean, well, Miami's a very special case. I mean, the Cubans are there are two big exceptions. The Cubans and Puerto Ricans are very different than everybody else in some very fundamental ways.
Tell us about it.
Well, I mean, the Cubans, because you started out with this political migration, after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, they were quite favored when they arrived here. I mean, they were because of American foreign policy, they were viewed as Cold War trophies to a certain extent, and the federal government invested a great deal of money in ensuring the success of the Cuban community, and they couldn't go back. So it was a very distinctive kind of migration. And the people who came initially were primarily well-educated. Many of them had some money, even if they had money in Cuba, even if they arrived here with very little. But they had a lot of human capital. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it was a political migration, not a labor migration. And this, there's now 40 years of history, a lot of different episodes, and it's gone through, that migration's gone through a lot of different changes. But you had a very dynamic, very resourceful group of initial settlers arriving in a city that was kind of on the way down, where there was a space they could fill. and helped make Miami a much more dynamic and economically successful place than it would have been otherwise. And the other important thing to remember about Cubans is that American policy has always been and remains that if a Cuban manages to get 1 foot on American soil, they're here legally. It's now, because of the rafters that get intercepted at sea and sent back, the policy now has a very funny name, which is it's a wet foot, dry foot policy. I mean, if you have 1 dry foot, you're in. And you're in legally, you're paroled into the country, within 5 years you can become a citizen. It's the best deal in
of any immigrant group.
Absolutely, the best deal that anybody born outside the United States can get to get in here. If you're captured with 2 wet feet, the Coast Guard sends you back to Cuba.
Even in the surf?
Even in the surf. And there was a court case about a group of people that were on an abandoned bridge piling, and it did go to a circuit court as to whether that constituted a dry foot or not, and I think they ultimately were allowed to stay.
Now the Puerto Ricans came under a very different situation.
Yeah, and entirely different, because I mean, Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory during the Spanish-American War, and at the turn of the 20th century, the United States declared that everybody born in Puerto Rico was a U.S. citizen, and there was a labor migration. Primarily to New York City during, it got started during World War II and then accelerated in the 1940s and early 50s of people who were mostly displaced agricultural workers in Puerto Rico who came to New York and sort of bought the last seats on the industrial economy and managed to ride it down. But it was they were, I mean, Puerto Rican culture in the United States was very much shaped by the politics of New York City, the predominance of the Democratic Party, very extensive welfare policies, and very much shaped by the period of decline in the New York economy from the late 1960s through the beginning of the 1980s when it sort of surged back.
And generalizations are always dangerous, but especially in the beginning, Cuban migrants tended to be more light-skinned, and Puerto Rican
it's a little more mixed. And yeah, I mean, the initial Cuban migration was from the upper classes, the middle classes, and tended to be more light-skinned, and it was in Cuba, unlike, I mean, both Cuba and Puerto Rico had been Spanish possessions until the end of the 19th century and had experienced very recent Spanish migration. So there are people there are Cubans in the United States whose ancestors spent 1 generation in Cuba but had come from Spain and really sort of were only in Cuba for less than a century. Very much a very different history than what you see in Mexico and Central and South America, where the Spanish colonization had ended several centuries before, and you had a different kind of racial mixing.
And before then, I don't know whether it's the 1960s, correct me on this, now we're in Texas, the Mexican Americans there actually had been there before the Texans, or the other Texans.
Yeah, there's an old stock population in Texas and in New Mexico, and actually more prominent in parts of New Mexico, where you find people who refer themselves as Spanish, and whose date their time back to before, not only before the Mexican-American War, but before Mexico's independence from Spain. And they're a fairly small part of that population, but the culture and the presence on the landscape of a Hispanic culture that predates the American culture is a very vivid part of a lot of Texas and the Southwest, and even parts of California.
Well, I mean, Mission Trail.
Yeah, things like, you get city names like San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco.
Is that how you pronounce them now?
I once dared the chief executive of a TV station in Los Angeles who was very proud of a newly hired Latino anchor to let the Latino anchor sign off saying the name of the city in Spanish. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And he was signing off saying his name in Spanish, but then saying, Los Angeles in English.
Now, has that changed?
No. And he just said we'd be finished. You can't say Los Angeles on the air on an English language station and hope to survive.
So someplace in the last 30 years, a whole bunch of new people start coming. How'd that start? Why'd that start?
Well, you had a series, you had some changes in policy that made it easier for people to come. Some made it easier for people to come legally. There had been, from Mexico, a program of temporary agricultural workers, the Bracero program, that started during World War II. It was basically designed to provide temporary workers while the boys went off to fight fascism. Right?
Yes,
and the growers liked it so much that it lasted until 1962. It just kept getting renewed. And you had a pattern, an entire generation of workers in Mexico and growers in the United States that had gotten used to this labor supply. And when the government said, well, we're not going to have a formal program, both sides, the employers and the workers, just said, well, fine, we'll just do this, go on at this point. At that point, it wasn't illegal to hire somebody who didn't have immigration documents here. So the flow started in the 1960s. You had population pressure in Mexico when the growth rates increased very rapidly, much faster than the Mexican economy was able to absorb new workers. And there was a series of changes over time in the U.S. economy and the U.S. population that created a demand for low-wage workers. The percentage of women who went to work in the United States increased very rapidly from the 1960s to the 1980s. And a lot of people were hired to do things that women used to do. And women working also created demand for new kinds of products and services. You had a very rapid acceleration in the number of people who were completing four-year degrees. And actually it started first finishing high school and then two-year degrees and four-year degrees, which actually still continues in the non-Hispanic white population in particular. So there was actually a smaller pool of people with lesser skills. And then the other thing that happened was that when baby boomers came of age in the 1970s in particular and on into really the middle of the 1980s, they did a lot of things other than have children. They postponed having children, and when they had children, they tended to have fewer of them than their parents had by far, and didn't quite make the replacement rate of 2 kids per couple. So you ended up then where we are now with a kind of demographic hole in our population, because you have very low birth cohorts starting from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. And there's a little baby boom echo at the end of the 1980s. But our population now is not producing all that many 20-year-olds, although it doesn't seem that way to you. It's not producing a lot of non-Hispanic white 20-year-olds.
Well, does that matter, or is it that it's not producing enough people to work in the lodging industry, hospitality industry, they call it, and those other things?
Well, the other, I mean, you had this narrowing of the native-born workforce and its credentialing upwards. At the same time that you had certain industries, like the hospitality industry, which grew and grew. I mean, there's a chicken and an egg question here. Did the hospitality industry grow based on very extensive use of low-wage labor because that labor was available, or because there was a sort of structural demand for it? I mean, if you hadn't had all those workers, would it have taken a different shape? I mean, the construction is the most recent example, where by far the largest share of new workers added to the construction industry over the last 5 years, particularly the home construction industry, have been recently arrived Hispanic immigrants. And we've developed an entire industry that's very successful, and that has helped in the dispersal of the economy into all kinds of corners of the country where you've seen economic growth develop. All these things are sort of tied together.
Well, let me back up on that, what you said about the dispersal. We're used to thinking of immigrants coming into gateway cities, whether they're New York, maybe York, right, or Miami these days, and maybe Los Angeles. But they're immigrants, and Latino immigrants in Springfield, Massachusetts, and South Carolina, and so forth. What's the story there?
Well, there's a very intense concentration of new arrivals in really 5 or 6 places. I mean, you mentioned several of them: Los Angeles, Chicago, a few others. Really right up into the middle of the 1980s. When the U.S. economy started to grow, in particular in the 1990s, it grew in a lot of different places, a lot of new places. It grew in the Washington area is a very good example, where you have 2 big new high-tech corridors leading out of the city in 2 different directions that didn't exist before. We have suburban counties and exurban counties that have had tremendous population growth. The Southeast developed in places like Charlotte, that became one of the great banking centers of America over the last 20 years. So this is attracting immigrants.
Yeah,
and people started spreading out.
Now, is it people, or I know from your writings, men?
It's men initially, but men being human beings eventually.
Being men.
Being men or women, either way, that you end up having both, and you can really time it. I mean, I've gone through this exercise with local government officials, where you get, it can seem very cheap, a very cheap form of economic development to import a few thousand young Mexican males who don't put a lot of demands.
They live in congregate living, they don't need schools.
They just want to work, they send a lot of the money home. It's really a matter of time. It's about 5 years, and you'll see women. And 5 years after that, you have to start hiring teachers, and this has happened repeatedly, in all kinds, particularly in places in North Carolina and Georgia and Iowa, Omaha, Nebraska, where the meatpacking industry essentially converted its workforce to one of recently arrived Hispanic immigrants, in a very deliberate, very conscious economic decision to convert the workforce to a non-unionized, non-urban workforce, to move meatpacking from cities that were close to the consumers to places that were close to the production. It's several, I mean, there are many industries.
So we're describing, in effect, some version of Ross Perot, the opposite of Ross Perot's giant sucking sound. You're describing a process where people are being drawn to America for jobs, and not necessarily, quote, jobs that no one else will do, but jobs where there's an interest and so forth. We don't have a lot of time left in today's show. Let me ask you, 20 years from now, 15 years from now, I think the projections are that 1 in 4 people living in this country will be of Latin American ancestry. How will they be doing? Will their children have graduated college? Will they be on the up escalator, as we like to say?
Who knows? I mean, what will determine it is a fairly simple factor, which is whether the country succeeds in educating the second generation, the children of immigrants. They're U.S. citizens, native-born, they're here, they're our kids, they're in our schools. At current rates, the profile is improving. It's certainly not as dire as things looked, say, 10 or 15 years ago. But you're still talking about really very substantial gaps in achievement between the children of Hispanic immigrants and the children of non-Hispanic whites. And in some places it's widening, like 4-year degree completion. And so you have the prospects of, I mean, if things go badly, in my mind, what you would get is a society that's stratified in a way that race and ethnicity and economic class overlay, where you have whites and some Asians at the top, some African Americans at the top, some African Americans in the middle, a lot of Hispanics and African Americans at the bottom, and distinct groups identifiable with economic outcomes. That's something we just spent 50 years trying very hard to get away from. And it would be really sort of tragic to end up back there again.
Well, in our next show, we should explore that a little bit more. Roberto Suro, on behalf of the University of Maryland, I want to thank you again for being with us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.